The first thing the US Navy announced was that 11 aircraft had been lost in 49 minutes over the Strait of Hormuz. The official explanation was electronic warfare. A layered Iranian jamming corridor had blinded the strike package mid-transit. The jets lost formation cohesion. Some flew into defensive missile envelopes. The loss was catastrophic but explainable. Except it wasn't, because the pilots who came back described something different. They described a contact that didn't behave like Iranian air defense. It was airborne, maneuverable, and it was already inside their radar picture before they detected it. That is not a jamming story. That is a threat classification story. And the moment you understand what they actually saw over the strait, the entire strategic picture of that 49 minutes collapses and rebuilds itself into something far more dangerous than an electronic warfare ambush. Here is what the visible story looked like and why it was designed to look that way. In the spring of 2026, the United States had committed 3 carrier strike groups to enforce a naval blockade of Iranian shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R Ford were already in theater. The combined air wing could theoretically generate over 800 combat sorties per day. That is the stated capability. That is also the number that looks impressive in briefings and is almost entirely irrelevant to what happened next. A multi-carrier presence in a confined strait is not a position of pure strength. It is a compression problem. The Strait of Hormuz is 34 miles wide at its narrowest. Both the inbound and outbound shipping lanes are only 2 miles each. 3 carrier groups in that geometry are not projecting power outward. They are stacking sortie generation, logistics, and communication dependencies into a corridor that any adversary with competent ISR has already mapped, measured, and filed. That was the first thing the visible story got wrong. The carriers were not the dominant variable. The airspace above them was. Now here is the detail that changed the interpretation of everything that followed. In the weeks before the 49-minute event, Russia had quietly confirmed export contracts for the Su-57E, its 5th-generation stealth fighter, in the Middle East. Algeria had received the first confirmed delivery. Iran had been in conversation with Moscow for months. Then, in April 2026, reports began circulating through open-source intelligence channels of a Su-57 transfer to Iranian-controlled airspace. The U.S. intelligence community assessed this as a show of force, a demonstration, a signal from Moscow that it had skin in the game without formally entering the conflict. That assessment was incomplete. And here is where the visible explanation starts to break apart. The Su-57, NATO designation Felon, is not a clean stealth aircraft in the Western sense. Its radar cross-section in X-band fire control frequencies is not dramatically smaller than a conventional fighter. American analysts had modeled this. The E-2D Hawkeye's UHF band radar aboard the carrier would detect it at range. The IRGC-21 infrared search and track pods on the FCA-18 Super Hornets had been upgraded specifically to detect reduced signature threats like the Su-57 at extended ranges without emitting radar energy. On paper, the Felon had limited stealth advantage over a Navy strike package equipped with IRST and data link support from the E-2D overhead. Here is what the paper did not account for. The Su-57 was never meant to win the stealth contest that day. It was meant to win the timing contest. The Su-57's N036 Bielka AS radar operates in multiple bands simultaneously, including L-band, which is a frequency range specifically capable of detecting low observable aircraft. But more critical than what the Su-57 sees is what it does with what it sees, and how quickly it acts on it. The Felon in 2026 was fielding AI-assisted sensor fusion and could cue its weapons system from data-linked sources beyond its own radar horizon. It did not need to light up its own fire control system to establish a targeting solution. It could remain passive, feeding from a wider network of Iranian ground-based radar, airborne sensors, and signals intelligence, and execute a beyond visual range engagement without generating the emissions that would identify it as an active threat. The Navy's IRST pods detect heat signatures. They are passive. They are effective. But they require the sensor platform to close range or hold an advantageous geometry. In a compressed strait, with multiple aircraft transiting simultaneously, the geometry was already set by the adversary, not by the carrier air wing. That is where the visible story finally collapses. The 11 aircraft were not lost to an Iranian air defense system running autonomously. They were lost to a coordinated engagement architecture in which the visible Iranian components, radar, surface-to-air missiles, coastal batteries, were the announced threat. The real geometry of the kill was being managed from airborne, by a platform that wasn't supposed to be there, operated by pilots who weren't Iranian. Here's the part most analysis missed entirely. Russia and Iran had conducted joint military exercises in the Strait of Hormuz in January 2026. China participated as a third actor. The stated purpose was navigational freedom. The actual product of those exercises was operational familiarity, shared communication protocols, battlespace deconfliction procedures, and an agreed-upon engagement geometry that Russian aerospace assets could integrate into Iranian air defense architecture without broadcasting the fusion from day one. In other words, by the time the 49-minute event occurred, the Su-57 wasn't entering an unfamiliar battlefield. It was executing a rehearsed role in a network it had already practiced inside. The visible Iranian air defense picture was not the complete picture. It was the foreground. The felon was operating in the background, using Iranian radar emissions as passive cueing and staying out of the frequency bands the Navy was listening for. That is not a show of force. That is an operational integration, and it means the original question, why did we lose 11 jets in 49 minutes, has a completely different answer than what was initially briefed. Now pull the frame back further, because the tactical detail only matters if you understand the strategic logic underneath it. The United States had designed its blockade enforcement around the assumption that Iran would be the primary threat actor. The carrier strike groups were configured for high sortie operations, mine clearing, maritime interdiction, sustained strike capability against Iranian coastal infrastructure. The escort destroyers were positioned to handle Iranian anti-ship missiles, specifically the Noor and Rod families, which have known profiles and known flight envelopes. None of that force architecture was optimized for a beyond visual range air-to-air threat from a fifth-generation platform operating passively inside a jammed electromagnetic environment. The Arleigh Burke destroyers in the screen carry SPY-1 or SPY-6 radar systems. They would detect an airborne contact, but the engagement timeline for a Su-57 firing long-range air-to-air weapons from passive data link queuing is compressed. The missiles are already moving before the targeting solution is fully built on the defensive side, and the 11 jets were not flying a defensive combat air patrol. They were configured for strike. Internal weapons loads optimized for ground attack, external fuel for range. That is a different aircraft than the one you want in a within-engagement zone air-to-air contest. The force was not wrong. It was calibrated for the right enemy, and then a second enemy used that calibration against it. There is a precedent for exactly this kind of misread, and it came from the same carrier air wing's own recent history. In the Red Sea earlier in 2025, the USS Harry S. Truman lost 3 FCA-18s during sustained combat operations. One of them was shot down by the USS Gettysburg, an American destroyer that misidentified 2 Super Hornets as inbound vol missiles and fired. The Navy's own investigation found the decision neither reasonable nor justified, but the deeper finding was structural. In a high-clutter electromagnetic environment with saturated threat tracking, identification friend or foe procedures broke down. Now take that same structural condition, high threat density, saturated tracking picture, IFF pressure, and add a passive 5th-generation platform that doesn't emit, doesn't appear on the Mode 4 transponder interrogation cycle, and is firing from data link geometry rather than its own radar. The 49-minute loss isn't just a tactical defeat. It is the stress test result of a force posture that had already shown a fault line and was then pushed exactly at that fault line. Here is what this means at the level of doctrine, not just the engagement. The United States Navy has spent decades building the most capable maritime strike force in history. That is not in question. But the assumptions embedded in that force about who the adversary is, how they will fight, which phase of the engagement they will contest. Those assumptions were written for a world where the United States held the technological initiative. And had adversaries fought below the threshold of peer capability, the Su-57's presence over the Strait of Hormuz, whether operated by Russian pilots under a Russian chain of command or transferred and crewed by Iranian aviators trained in Russia, represents a category shift. It is not Iran acquiring a capable fighter. It is Russia inserting operational logic into a conflict while maintaining plausible distance from formal belligerent status. Moscow does not need to declare war. It needs to change the cost calculus. It needs the United States to fight a 2-front air-to-air problem inside a 1-front air defense plan. It needs the geometry of the strait, where the inbound and outbound shipping lanes are 2 miles each, and 3 carrier groups have no room to maneuver laterally, to work against the force it was designed to confine. And it needed the United States to keep looking at the visible Iranian threat long enough that the invisible Russian geometry was already inside effective weapons range before the picture updated. That is exactly what happened. So what do you do with a force posture that was right for yesterday's adversary and wrong for today's? The Navy is not going to pull back from the strait. The blockade is politically committed, logistically in motion, and strategically necessary if the pressure campaign against Iran is to hold. What changes is the sensor picture. The E-2D Hawkeye's UHF radar has detection capability against reduced signature aircraft. The IRGC-21 pods on the Super Hornets were built for exactly this environment. But detection is not the same as engagement success, and engagement success in a passive data link environment requires different rules of engagement, specifically, the authority to engage contacts that haven't yet declared hostile intent through a mission. That is a command authority problem, not a technology problem, and it does not get solved in 49 minutes. The deeper issue is that the joint exercise Russia conducted in January 2026 was not analyzed as operational rehearsal. It was filed as political signaling. The difference between those two assessments is 11 aircraft and the pilots who flew them. The visible story over the Strait of Hormuz was about Iran, blockade, and oil transit security. It still is. 20% of the world's oil and gas moves through that 34-mile corridor, and whoever controls the air above it controls the pressure valve on the global energy market. But the real story, the one that changes the strategic calculation for every carrier deployment, every allied escort mission, and every future engagement planning cycle, is about what Russia just demonstrated without firing a single declared shot. It demonstrated that a third party with advanced aerospace capability can insert itself into a bilateral conflict through technology transfer, operational integration, and rehearsed network architecture, and generate first-mover lethality inside an adversary's strike package, before that adversary has legally or publicly identified Russia as a belligerent. That is not a one-theater problem. That is a doctrine problem. And the 49 minutes over the Strait of Hormuz are now the data point every Navy strike planner will be briefed on before the next deployment anywhere near a coastline where Russian equipment, where Russian advisors, or Russian pilots have been present. The carriers are still in the strait, the blockade is still enforced, the sorties are still launching, but the picture of who is fighting whom just became significantly less certain. And that uncertainty is exactly where Russia intended to live. If you want to understand what happens when the Navy's threat picture updates mid-engagement, the next video covers exactly how the E-2D and the IRGC-21 system are supposed to close that gap, and where they still fall short.